So can we all come to the conclusion that Leigh Steinberg doesn't want Tua to be the number one pick in the draft?
Dude, that was the quote of the week. That quote could be the quote of the off season once this game ends.
Yeah.
That is absolutely classic.
Football at 4. We pushed it back to a little bit later this hour because Leigh was joining us at that spot, but John McMullen's here, and Johnny Mac. So it sounds as if Leigh, who's representing Tua, he told us that if he was in charge of the astronauts, he would hope Mike Brown was the commissioner of the moon, and basically said he hopes Cincy falls in love with Joe Burrow. Because he was basically saying you want your client to not be the number one pick, but to go to the best organization. And I said, so jokingly, so you don't want him to go number one. And then he basically went on the diatribe of, no, that's not what I want. I hope he falls in love with Joe Burrow. But I guess it shows you the state of the Cincinnati Bengals around the league.
Yeah, I've mentioned that in the past, and I've talked about it with Marvin Lewis. I think people don't understand how good of a coach he was because he lost all those playoff games. But if you look at how Cincinnati runs their organization, cheapest organization in football, which Leigh might have told you, but, when you talk about salary cap, there is no salary cap for coaching staff, scouting staff, behind-the-scenes personnel, things like that. And the Bengals are just cheap, and they've been that way for years, and it's difficult to win when everybody else is doing everything possible from not only a monetary standpoint, but also just those types of things and how they help as far as facilities, as far as they help in luring the best coaches, the best scouts, things like that. It makes it more difficult. But more importantly, did you get the Leigh Steinberg invitation to the Leigh Steinberg Super Bowl party?
We were invited to the Leigh Steinberg party. Unfortunately, the party is on Saturday, and we are leaving on Friday. So I do hear word around Radio Row is that the Leigh Steinberg party is the Super Bowl of the Super Bowl parties.
Yeah, go every year. I will not be there this year because I'm not there, but it's always a fun time.
Yeah, I mean, there's always big parties here, but that one apparently is the big one. But Scott was over at the NFL Network, had some of their hosts available today, and as we're kind of getting closer to this game, one thing kind of that all of the guests that we've talked to is standing out is both teams seem very loose. But one thing I find interesting about this week, do you, John, find anything interesting in the locations of the teams? That Andy Reid's team is staying an hour from here, and Kyle Shanahan's team is on Miami Beach.
No, I mean, in theory, I get where people are going with that, and the fact that there's, if you talk about sports in general, and you talk about whether it's NFL teams, you heard it with the Eagles when they had to go to Miami. NBA teams, Major League Baseball, the so-called South Florida flu, because it's such a fun place to be, and there's so much of a party atmosphere in Miami Beach. But, I think that if you're an organization, if you're a head coach, you've got a firm grasp on that. And you're either have a disciplined team or you don't have a disciplined team. And if you're in South Florida and you want to be in Miami Beach, you're going to find a way to go there if you're not focused. So I think I don't put too much emphasis into that.
John, I was talking to Kurt Warner a little while ago, and one of the things he was talking about was the way that he and Mike Martz were able to kind of push the envelope with offenses back in the days of the great Rams offenses they had. And he sees similarities in the way that Mahomes and Andy Reid are working together to kind of push that envelope. How impressive is it to see what Mahomes has done with Andy? And I think also at the same token, what Andy has done with Pat and the way he's evolved over time.
Yeah, great minds think alike. I've made that description consistently. That's who Kansas City reminds me of, is that greatest show on turf Rams team, because they put so much pressure on opposing defenses. They never stop. It's just a constant wave. I remember those Rams teams, forget, they turned the football over a little bit too much. Nobody cares, though, because it didn't matter. If they turned it over, even if you scored, they were coming back and scoring and scoring and scoring. So it never affected them that much. And I see a similar thing with Kansas City, and you saw it being down 24 points. I mentioned that the other day on the show. It's, typically an NFL game is over. You're done. You're down 24. You don't have a chance, and they came back to win by 20 points. That's how dominant that offense is. But you also mentioned Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid. I mean, when you're talking about young quarterbacks, it's so important to get in the right spot. And look, Patrick Mahomes is great. I think he would have been great anywhere, but I do think he's helped immensely by being with Andy Reid. I just think that, I often think back to Donovan McNabb and that draft and how many quarterbacks were failures. I often think if one of those other quarterbacks got with Andy Reid, may have things been completely different. I think Mahomes is on a different category. I think like I said, he'd be a star anywhere. But look, he's being maxed out by Andy Reid. I think it's fair to say that.
When you look at on the other side, Jimmy Garoppolo, I'll throw another one out here. I talked to Michael Irvin. And, there's a lot of things I think Michael gets a little over-animated about, but I thought he hit this spot on, and I hadn't really considered it. He said, Jimmy G is really between a rock and a hard place here because he came from New England, won 2 rings as a backup with Brady, and so he's kind of been in the shadow of Brady. At the same token, you also have, and then Irvin called Brady the greatest of all time, rightfully so. He said now he's also Jimmy G's going up against, in this game, the GOAT of this time, in which the way everybody's kind of looking at Patrick Mahomes. So he said he's really in a rock and a hard place. If he doesn't win this game, he's got 2 GOATs overshadowing him here. How do you put the tough spot that Jimmy Garoppolo's in? Do you agree with Michael and see that Jimmy G is in a bit of a hard spot here?
No, and I take it the other way. I look at it more as there isn't as much pressure on it. I mean, so many people focus on the quarterbacks, and if it was just, San Francisco wouldn't have a chance in this game, but they do. It's a very close spread for a reason. They certainly have the better defense. They have the better running game. Typically, that's how you win championships. People will still use that old school thinking. So I think that applies to Patrick Mahomes because too many people do boil it down to quarterback versus quarterback. And if he loses the Super Bowl to Jimmy Garoppolo, people will say, well, maybe Patrick Mahomes isn't that good. And even more so for Andy Reid because of all the narrative surrounding Andy Reid. Can't win the big one. He's got Patrick Mahomes. If you lose to Jimmy Garoppolo, people will boil it down to that. So in a lot of ways, I think from Jimmy's perspective, he's playing with house money. He's not supposed to be able to compete with these guys, and he's there.
John, how much of a factor, and this stems from Grayson bringing up Garoppolo being in the shadow of Tom Brady for 2 years, for 2 of those Super Bowl runs, appearances, and victories, how much of that is he able to use this week for this game, do you believe? I think that's a little nugget that a lot of people aren't discussing and maybe a lot of fans don't realize. I understand being the starting quarterback is a whole different animal than being the backup, but he knows the schedule, the routine, the halftime length. I mean, he's been there, done that, and he's also been there, done that behind the greatest of all time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps anytime you're in that environment before. I think it helps whether you're a starter or a backup, just living through it because you guys are in the midst of it right now. You know all the hoopla that surrounds it. It's different than a normal game, even a championship game, even a playoff game. There's so many people pulling you in different directions. So I think to have that experience is always helpful. I certainly don't think it can hurt. And it was interesting because you don't think his backup quarterbacks as Super Bowl winners, but as you mentioned, It's a guy who's already won Super Bowl rings. If you take the Eli Manning tact, if he wins another one, he's got 3 rings. He's a Hall of Famer. So if you look at it that way.
Winning, you're in.
Yeah, exactly. So to be in that type of environment, I think it's always helpful.
What about, you brought up, John, that Andy Reid's bringing the greatness out of Patrick Mahomes right now. I've heard some murmurs, specifically from the guys that are on before us, Harry and Eitan, that Mahomes is bringing out the greatness in Andy, meaning Mahomes is the ultimate bailout for the Andy mistakes. Andy falls down big 2 straight playoff games, and Mahomes bails him out. If I were there with Harry and
Eitan, I would slap him. That's silly.
I knew that'd be your answer.
Well, no, and it's not to say Patrick.
And I'm not saying you're wrong.
And I got freezing cold take for pointing out during the draft process that Patrick Mahomes, remember, he wasn't supposed to go as high as he did when the Kansas City Chiefs moved up to get him. He was supposed to be low 20s, maybe mid-20s, somewhere in that range. A lot of people, you can go back and Google it. We'll talk in college and playing in an air raid. They were not good. And I got news for you. People, they're still not great, but they've improved dramatically from where they were. And I just can't help thinking if he went to a different environment, if he went to a different organization, say Chicago, picked him number 2 instead of Mitchell Trubisky, and everyone criticizes him. And then he's with John Fox that first year. I don't think he's the Patrick Mahomes you see right now. People assume it's going to be, I always use that term, vacuum. He's going to be the same in every situation. I don't think he's even close to being the player he is right now if he would have went to a team like Chicago.
Yeah, I agree. You have to credit the Chiefs organization, specifically Andy Reid. Here's another kind of hot take potential question for you, but it's interesting when you bring up the previous 2 games where the Chiefs fell behind big. Obviously, the Houston game sticks out to everyone. Do you think that's on the Chiefs' minds at all? They're human. It has to be a little bit. But this week, as far as preparation, how do they prepare for this game? And are they doing it in a sense of how can we avoid falling behind in this game? Because if we fall behind in this game against this team, I don't care who you are, it's going to be a lot more challenging to come back and win.
Yeah, I don't think they want to fall down again. And certainly, 24 points, that's absurd. That was such a bad start to that game against Houston. And even getting behind against Tennessee, that's not optimal. Even though they're capable of doing it, too many things can go wrong if you get in those situations. Bounce of the football, maybe a fumble, maybe somebody strips you, and all of a sudden you're looking at a really deep hole you can't dig yourself out of. So I think the goal is to play a cleaner game early. And, hey, I think if they're able to do that, I don't think this is going to be as close as most people think it's going to be. I've talked about it a lot. I think San Francisco can certainly win the game, but they have a small margin for error because if they get behind 2 scores, they don't have the firepower to come back. Can't just run the ball because Kansas City is not going to sit on the lead. They're going to keep coming at you with all those weapons. So I think from that standpoint, it's much more difficult for San Francisco. But, yeah, Kansas City does not want another bad start. If you keep doing that over and over and over again, eventually it's going to come back to bite you.
All right, Johnny Mac, football at 4. We're obviously on Radio Row with a lot of Super Bowl coverage for you all this week. So John was kind enough to jump to the bottom of the hour, and we will dive into some more of the game tomorrow, get John's pick for the game, although it sounds like he's leaning a certain way. Real quick, before we let you run, Bud, we're down here, so we're not as immersed with what's going on back home, but any new news or names popping up with that Eagles offensive coordinator or coaching jobs?
The only news is the fact that the Eagles are going to announce the staff as a whole next week after the Super Bowl, and they're waiting to the Super Bowl after the Super Bowl for a couple of interviews. So what does that indicate? That means they have a name on one of the two staffs. We know it's not Mike Kafka. That's not going to be a possibility, so that leans you towards San Francisco. And you have Mike LaFleur, you have Mike McDaniel. I think McDaniel would be more likely of those two that San Francisco would potentially allow to interview. But it's clear they're waiting for somebody, and they're waiting for somebody because they're in that game.
Makes sense. Sounds like it, too. So we'll keep our eye on that. And, of course, if anything happens, Football at 4 will have it for you at JF McMullen here on the Sports Best. John, you're missing a no-food event. There's no food served here at Radio Row this year. Yeah,
I saw Ross Tucker complaining about that. So I'm
him and everybody else.
Yeah, that's a bad.
Not even not a water, no coffee, nothing.
From when you compare the NBA to the NFL obviously the most popular sport, but the NBA does the finals so much better than the NFL does the Super Bowl. They have hospitality every night. They give you free drinks, never mind food.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go try to find coffee. Not going to work.
And I mean alcoholic drinks, not coffee.
Last year in Atlanta, at the end of the day, when we were done, they had a room that had beers and they had everything. I mean, you're talking about Atlanta.
Yeah,
this is Miami. This is supposed to be the party place,
roll
right?
That out for an hour or two, but
But
the NFL. I mean, nobody likes to hear us media people complain about that kind of stuff, but it is really they do a bad job with that.
Well,
no fun league.
We do a good job here with Football at 4. Johnny Mac, thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, guys.